Everyday life seems to present identity as something obvious. When you look at a familiar object, such as your own keys, you do not hesitate to say that it is the same set of keys you used yesterday. When you meet an old friend after several years, you recognize them as the same person you once knew. You do not marvel at the continuity of their existence. Identity usually feels natural, stable, and beyond question. Yet beneath this smooth surface lies one of the deepest and most enduring metaphysical puzzles. What does it mean for something to remain the same over time, even though it changes in countless ways? In what sense is anything identical to its past self? From the moment philosophers began to reflect on identity, they recognized its complexity. The Greek thinker Heraclitus famously said that one cannot step into the same river twice because the waters are always flowing. Yet the river seems to remain the same river even as its contents are constantly replaced. This paradox of change and identity lies at the heart of metaphysics. It requires us to ask what we mean by sameness and how it relates to transformation. Identity is not only a philosophical puzzle but also a practical necessity. Our social practices depend on judgments of sameness. We hold people legally responsible for past actions because we claim they are the same person who performed them. We maintain property rights because we consider objects to endure through time. We form emotional bonds with animals, places, and artworks because we believe in their persistence. Even scientific inquiry relies on notions of identity, since experimental results often require tracking the same entity across different conditions. Without some understanding of identity, everyday life would become unintelligible. In this lecture, we will explore the metaphysics of identity, focusing on how objects persist over time. We will look at the distinction between numerical and qualitative identity, examine criteria for identity in different contexts, and consider various theories about how objects endure. We will also explore thought experiments that challenge our intuitions and force us to refine our concepts. Throughout, we aim to understand what it means for anything to be the same through change. One of the first distinctions to grasp is between numerical identity and qualitative identity. Numerical identity refers to being one and the same thing. When we say the apple on the table is the same apple we bought yesterday, we are claiming numerical identity. There is one object, not two. Qualitative identity refers to having the same qualities. Two apples that look alike may be qualitatively identical in many aspects, such as color, shape, or texture, yet they remain numerically distinct. The difference is not subtle but fundamental. Numerical identity is about unity. Qualitative identity is about similarity. This distinction helps clarify many puzzles. Suppose two coins are minted at the same time and bear identical markings. They may be qualitatively indistinguishable, yet they are not numerically identical. If one is lost and the other remains, no one would claim that the lost coin still exists. Numerical identity cannot be replaced by similarity, no matter how close. Philosophers use this distinction to articulate the logical structure of identity. A central principle, often called Leibniz's law, states that if two things are identical, then they share all the same properties. If object A has a property that object B lacks, A and B cannot be the same. This principle is powerful but also raises complications. What kinds of properties must be shared? Are temporary properties included? If an object changes color, does it lose its identity? Clearly not, but the principle must be applied carefully. Understanding numerical and qualitative identity prepares us to think more deeply about how things persist through change. If an object loses some properties but retains others, what determines whether it remains numerically identical? How do we distinguish between changes that affect identity and changes that do not? These questions lead us directly into the metaphysics of persistence. Criteria of identity are the principles that determine when an object at one time is the same as an object at another time. Different kinds of things may require different criteria. The identity of ordinary physical objects may depend on continuity of matter or structure. The identity of artworks may depend on intention or context. The identity of natural kinds may depend on underlying biological or chemical properties. The identity of artifacts may depend on function or purpose. Each domain invites its own questions. For objects composed of matter, we might initially think that identity is a matter of material continuity. If most of the matter remains the same, the object is the same. Yet this principle quickly proves inadequate. Consider a wooden ship that undergoes periodic repairs. Old planks are removed and replaced with new ones, until eventually none of the original planks remain. Is the ship still the same ship? Most people would say yes. The ship's identity seems to depend on more than its material components. Perhaps it depends on continuity of structure or shape, or perhaps on continuity of function, or perhaps on historical continuity, the fact that the ship has been maintained and recognized as the same vessel throughout its existence. Different objects seem to have different criteria. A clay statue appears to have a different identity criterion than the lump of clay from which it is formed. If the statue is crushed, the statue ceases to exist, but the clay remains. This suggests that identity depends on form as well as material. Similarly, rivers have identity criteria that differ from those of stones or buildings. A river is defined by its course and flow, not by the particular molecules of water that run through it. This shows that identity is not a one-size-fits-all notion. It must be understood relative to the kind of entity involved. When we think about identity, we must ask what features of an object are essential to it. What does it take for this particular thing to survive changes? This leads us to the distinction between essential and accidental properties. An essential property is a property that an object must have in order to be what it is. An accidental property is a property that an object can gain or lose without affecting its identity. For example, being made of wood might be an essential property of a specific wooden sculpture, while being brown might be accidental. A sculpture might be repainted without ceasing to be the same sculpture, but replacing the wood with metal would likely create a new artwork. Essential properties are important because they constrain how things can change while remaining themselves. If we identify the essential properties of an object, we can determine what kinds of changes it can survive. For biological organisms, essential properties may include being alive or belonging to a particular species. For artifacts, the essential property may be function or design. For natural objects, essential properties may involve chemical composition or structural pattern. However, identifying essential properties is not always easy. Consider the case of a watch. If we replace its battery, it remains the same watch. If we replace its strap, it remains the same watch. If we replace every component gradually, at what point does it cease to be the same? These questions challenge our intuitions and force us to think about the foundations of identity. Some philosophers argue that essential properties are determined by the kind to which an object belongs. For example, the essential property of water is its molecular structure, H2O. If a substance does not have that structure, it is not water. Yet, for many everyday objects, essential properties are less clear. Does a broom remain the same broom if its entire handle is replaced? Folk intuitions often lead toward historical continuity. If the same person continues to use it as their broom, perhaps it remains the same object. This suggests that identity may depend partly on human practices and recognitions. The Ship of Theseus is one of the most famous thought experiments in the metaphysics of identity. According to ancient legend, the Athenians preserved the ship of the hero Theseus by replacing its decaying planks with new ones. Over many years, every plank was replaced. Philosophers ask whether the ship, after all the replacements, is still the same ship. Intuitively, we often say yes. The ship has been maintained continuously, its form and function have remained stable, and it occupies a continuous history. Yet the thought experiment becomes more complicated when we add another twist. Imagine that all the old planks that were removed are gathered and reconstructed into a second ship. Which of the two is the real Ship of Theseus? The first ship has perfect historical continuity, but the second ship has the original material. We seem forced into a dilemma. Either both are the original ship, which seems impossible, or neither is, which seems equally strange. This puzzle shows that identity cannot be understood solely through material continuity or through historical continuity alone. It may also suggest that identity is not always a precise matter. Some philosophers argue that identity is a vague concept and that in borderline cases there may be no fact of the matter. Others insist that identity must be precise, even if we do not know the answer. The Ship of Theseus encourages us to question the assumptions behind our ordinary judgments. It leads us to recognize that identity is not a simple concept. It involves the interaction of material, structural, functional, and historical factors. And sometimes our intuitions may not point to a single correct answer. Another classic puzzle concerns a lump of clay and the statue formed from it. Suppose you mold a lump of clay into the shape of a human figure. The statue and the lump of clay seem to occupy the same space, yet they appear to have different properties. The statue is delicate and has artistic value. The clay is sturdy and its identity does not depend on shape. If you crush the statue, the clay survives. This suggests that the statue and the clay are not identical. But if they are not identical, how can two distinct objects occupy the same space at the same time? This question pushes us to examine our assumptions about how objects and their identities exist together. Perhaps identity depends on functional roles or on the intentions behind creation. Perhaps we need to distinguish between material objects and formal objects. This example also highlights the role of human practices in determining identity. A statue is not just shaped clay. It is clay that has been intentionally crafted into an artwork. Its identity is tied to artistic intention and social recognition. This suggests that identity may be partly culturally constructed. Yet clay itself seems to have a more natural identity determined by its chemical composition. This illustrates how different categories of being, natural and artificial, generate different identity criteria. When we ask how objects persist over time, we enter one of the most technically complex areas of metaphysics. The central question is whether objects endure or perdure. To endure means to remain wholly present at each moment of existence. According to this view, an object exists as a complete entity at every moment. It does not have temporal parts. It simply exists at different times. This view matches everyday intuition. We naturally think of ourselves as whole beings at each moment. When we say that our car parked outside is the same car we drove yesterday, we imagine that the whole car existed yesterday and the whole car exists today. Endurantism preserves this intuition. It portrays objects as fully present entities that remain identical through time. However, endurantism faces challenges. If an object is wholly present at every moment, how can it differ between moments? If your height changes over the years, how can the numerically identical object have different properties at different times? Endurantists often respond by saying that objects have temporary properties. They possess different properties at different times without losing their identity. But this leads to further questions. How can something be both tall and not tall? The answer usually involves temporal qualifiers. You are tall at one time and not tall at another. But the metaphysics of such qualifiers remains complex. Perdurantism offers an alternative. According to this view, objects persist by having temporal parts. Just as a road stretches across space and has different spatial segments, an object stretches across time and has different temporal segments. Each temporal part represents the objects at a different state. The whole object, then, is a four-dimensional entity composed of its temporal parts. Perdurantism avoids the problem of temporary properties. If you are tall in your adulthood and short in your childhood, this is not a contradiction. These properties belong to different temporal parts of you. You are a four-dimensional entity with different stages. This view aligns well with the physics of space-time. If time is another dimension similar to space, then objects may naturally be extended across time as they are across space. The universe, according to this view, contains world lines, which represent the histories of objects. Identity through time becomes a matter of continuity of a world line. However, Perdurantism also challenges intuition. We do not experience ourselves as four-dimensional beings. We experience ourselves as wholly present. Moreover, the idea of temporal parts raises questions about unity. How do temporal parts combine to form a single object? What binds them together? These questions push us to examine the metaphysical underpinnings of continuity. The debate between endurantism and perdurantism overlaps with a broader distinction between three-dimensionalism and four-dimensionalism. Three-dimensionalists believe that objects are wholly present at every moment. Four-dimensionalists believe that objects extend through time like they extend through space. This debate has implications for many aspects of metaphysics. It influences how we think about change, motion, causation, and the nature of existence. Three-dimensionalism emphasizes the unity and persistence of objects. Four-dimensionalism emphasizes the reality of temporal structure and the continuity of histories. Some philosophers attempt to combine insights from both views. They argue that some objects endure, while others perdure. For example, they may suggest that elementary particles perdure while macroscopic objects endure. Others argue that identity is not a matter of deep metaphysical structure, but of linguistic or conceptual conventions. The debate illustrates the richness of metaphysics. It shows that even something as familiar as an object persisting through time invites multiple theoretical frameworks, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. Understanding identity requires us to think carefully about change. Change is not simply the alteration of some features while others remain. It is a process that challenges the unity of an object. If something changes too much, we may no longer consider it the same. For example, if a house is completely demolished and rebuilt, is it the same house? If a computer is upgraded piece by piece, does it remain the same machine? These questions reveal the tension between change and continuity. Philosophers often distinguish between replacement and transformation. Replacement involves substituting parts without altering the underlying identity. Transformation involves altering the structure or function so deeply that the original identity is lost. Yet, the boundary between replacement and transformation is often unclear. Consider the case of a car that has all its components replaced over many years. Some mechanics might say it remains the same car if it retains its chassis or frame. Others might say that its identity depends on its registration or history. Still others might suggest that the car's identity is a matter of convention. This example shows that identity is not always determined by strict metaphysical rules. It may depend on practical considerations and social practices. This ambiguity should not discourage philosophical reflection. Rather, it reveals that identity is not a single, universal relation, but a family of related concepts. To understand identity, we must consider the nature of the objects involved, the context in which identity judgments are made, and the purposes these judgments serve. Biological organisms present unique challenges for theories of identity. Unlike artifacts or objects, organisms grow, develop, heal, and adapt. Their matter is constantly replaced. Cells die and are renewed. The organism persists despite complete material turnover. This has led many philosophers to argue that the identity of organisms depends on organizational continuity rather than material continuity. A biological organism is often understood as a self-maintaining system. It processes energy, repairs damage, and sustains a dynamic equilibrium. Its identity lies in its functional organization. As long as the organism continues to perform the activities that define its life, it remains the same organism. Yet, biological identity also involves developmental stages. A caterpillar becomes a butterfly. A child becomes an adult. Are these stages numerically identical? Intuitively, we say yes, but the transformation is so radical that it challenges our understandings. Biological identity invites us to consider whether identity through change may depend more on continuity of life processes than on continuity of material or structure. Evolution adds another layer. Species too have identities. They persist through generations, although individual organisms come and go. The identity of species depends on genetic and reproductive patterns. This suggests that identity may operate at multiple levels of biological reality. Artifacts are objects created by human beings for specific purposes. Their identity often depends on function. A knife remains the same knife as long as it can perform the function for which it was created. If the blade breaks beyond repair, it may cease to be the same knife, even if the handle remains. Artifacts can challenge simple metaphysical theories. Consider a computer. If its central processor is replaced, does it remain the same computer? The answer may depend on whether we prioritize functional continuity, historical continuity, or material continuity. Different contexts may emphasize different criteria. Artworks present additional complexities. The identity of a painting may depend on the intention of the artist and the history of the work. A restoration that changes too much of the original may be considered inauthentic. In contrast, a musical composition may exist in many performances. The identity of the work does not lie in a particular performance, but in the structure of the composition. This shows that identity criteria vary widely across different kinds of artifacts. Identity is not only a metaphysical issue, but also a practical one. In law, questions of identity are crucial. When a contract is signed, the same legal person must be held responsible. When a crime is committed, the same person must be prosecuted. Law assumes that persons persist through time in a way that allows responsibility and accountability. Ethics also depends on identity. Promises, commitments, and obligations presuppose personal continuity. If the person who made the promise is no longer the same, in what sense is the promise binding? Identity shapes moral responsibility and interpersonal relationships as well. Even everyday interactions depend on identity. When we greet someone we know, we assume that they are the same person we met before. When we revisit a childhood home, we assume that it is the same place. Identity judgments structure our social world. These practical considerations reveal that identity is not merely an abstract puzzle. It is woven into the fabric of human life. Understanding identity helps us understand ourselves and our relationships with others. Some philosophers propose that identity is not a matter of metaphysical essence or material continuity, but of structure or narrative. According to structural accounts, an object's identity lies in its organized pattern. The components may change, but the pattern remains. This view aligns with process ontologies and with systems thinking. Narrative accounts, though more often applied to persons, can illuminate object identity as well. According to these views, identity is the story that connects different stages of an object through time. The identity of a building, for example, might lie in its history, its social role, and the ways it has been used. Its persistence is not simply a matter of structure or material, but of the narrative that binds its stages. These views broaden the metaphysical landscape. They show that identity may not always be reducible to strict logical principles. In some domains, identity may be partly interpretive. This does not undermine metaphysics, but enriches it by acknowledging the complexity of the world. Identity and persistence are central to metaphysics because they shape our understanding of change, continuity, and existence. They force us to examine the principles by which we track objects through time. They challenge us to think about the roles of matter, structure, function, intention, and narrative. They reveal that the world is not composed of static entities, but of dynamic beings that evolve and transform. As we proceed in these metaphysics lectures, the questions raised will continue to appear. They will shape our discussion of causation, free will, objects, social reality, and personal identity. They remind us that the world is not a collection of fixed objects, but a complex web of transformations. In the next lecture, we will turn to the nature of causation and the laws of nature, exploring how events relate to one another and how the universe maintains its order. Identity and persistence will remain in the background, reminding us that everything that changes must change as something.